Thank you for joining me as I conclude my examination of the book Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart. In this video, we will begin and also finish part 4 of the book, which is titled Reaction and Retreat, Modernity and the Eclipse of the Human. So let's get started with chapter 16, which is titled Secularism and Its Victims. Hart opens the penultimate chapter of the book, with a rather familiar-sounding complaint about a certain book written by Christopher Hitchens. Quote, "The rather petulant subtitle that Christopher Hitchens has given his rather petulantly titled God is Not Great is How Religion Poisons Everything. Does he really mean precisely everything? Would that apply then, confining ourselves just to things Christian, to ancient and medieval hospitals, leper asylums, orphanages, almshouses, and hostels? To the golden rule, love thine enemies, judge not, lest ye be judged? Prophetic admonitions against oppressing the poor, and commands to feed and clothe and comfort those in need? Surely it cannot be the case that if only purged of the toxin of faith, those things would be even better than they are. Were it not for faith, it seems fairly obvious most of them would have no existence at all." Well, given the authorial voice Hart has established to this point, which is that of the most flatulent, crotchety old man who ever lived, it doesn't surprise me that he would characterize Hitchens as being petulant. When he knew that religious folks would be paying attention, Hitchens often seemed to calculate his every word to maximize the discomfort of religious people who may have been paying attention. I can only imagine the pleasure he got from the tongue-clucking and pearl-clutching he provoked from grandiloquent buffoons like David Bentley Hart or William Lane Craig, who isn't nearly as thoughtful as Hart, but thinks he is. I'm pretty sure Hitchens chose the subtitle How Religion Poisons Everything, at least in part, because he knew it would throw his critics, and particularly his conservative Christian critics, into an appalled tizzy. And it worked. I don't think I've yet read or heard a response to that book from a Christian that hasn't spent more time objecting to that subtitle than to answering the many other arguments Hitchens makes on the book's actual pages. Now, do I think it's excessive to say that religion poisons everything? Maybe. It depends on what you mean by that. I will congratulate Hart for his response. He seems to be reading the subtitle in the way Hitchens intended it. Many other Christian critics have read that subtitle to mean that religion was absolute poison, as was anything connected to it, including things like hospitals and almshouses. But as Hitchens himself explained often, he wasn't arguing that religious people or groups were incapable of doing genuine good. He wasn't saying that everything done by religion or by religious people, to state it more properly, is poison or is of no goodness or no value at all. He was arguing that the good works religious people do would be just as possible without religion, and that they would actually be better if done not in the name of religion, because good done for its own sake, for the sake of helping other people and improving the state of the world, was preferable to Hitchens than good done in the name of a non-existent God, or in the hope of an imaginary eternal reward, or at the command of some church authority. Hitchens' point was that charity and kindness were tainted by attaching them unnecessarily to religion. As Hitchens saw it, good works didn't redeem the church. It was the church that defiled good works. Now, Hart doesn't agree with this, obviously, but at least he's disagreeing with an argument that Hitchens actually makes in God is Not Great and elsewhere throughout his career, not the many straw man versions presented by many of Hart's fellow apologists. So, what about Hart's response? Would things like hospitals, almshouses, orphanages, and the golden rule be better if purged of the toxin of faith? Hart says no, because he thinks that without religion, and specifically without Christianity, these things wouldn't even exist. Hitchens, and I agree with Hitchens on this, says yes, because these things don't need religion, any religion, to validate them. The moral principles and empathetic impulses that underlie them predate religion and can be justified without appealing to any god or any scripture or any prophet's message or the supposed divine authority of any person or institution. As I have argued throughout this series, what Hart claims as Christian virtues are actually human virtues. But Hart finally gets around to addressing this argument. He says, quote, "One labels anything one dislikes, even if it is found in a purely secular setting, religion, while simultaneously claiming that everything good in the arts, morality, or any other sphere, even if it emerges within an entirely religious setting, has only an accidental association with religious belief and is really, in fact, common human property. By the same token, every injustice that seems to follow from a secularist principle is obviously an abuse of that principle, while any evil that comes wrapped in a cassock is unquestionably an undiluted expression of religion's very essence." So part of this I actually agree with, and part of it I disagree with. The part of it I agree with is this. Like Hart, I think that many of my fellow atheists and critics of religion in general, whether they happen to be atheists themselves or not, should stop treating religiously motivated atrocities as more religiously authentic or more authentic representations of that religion than religiously motivated acts of altruism. Atheists will often say things like, well, those terrorists are only doing what their religion tells them to do, and then they'll also say things like, well, sure, there are moderate and liberal religious people, they just don't take their religions very seriously. I really wish that atheists would stop saying things like this. Just as I find it annoying when apologists like Hart want their religion to get all the credit but none of the blame, I find it very annoying when critics of religion do the opposite and argue that religion should get all of the blame for the intolerance and violence committed in its name, but none of the credit for the charity and the other good works that religious folks have often done. Let me make it clear that I'm not saying religion shouldn't get any of the blame. If there's a group of people who are terrorists who say they're killing in the name of Islam, for example, I take them at their word, and I think it would be absurd to argue that the religious beliefs of Muslims who commit acts of terrorism were not an influence whatsoever. By the same token, if a far-right Christian sets off a bomb at an abortion clinic, it would be absurd to argue that their religious beliefs were not an influence on their actions. But acknowledging that the religious beliefs of a given person or a given organization were an influence on their actions is not the same thing as saying this happened because of Islam or this happened because of Christianity, as though all Muslims and all Christians would be doing the same sorts of things if only they took their faiths as seriously as the terrorists did. Many of my fellow atheists make this argument all the time, and I find it ignorant and simplistic and reductive. But having said that, I do not accept what Hart does when he accuses secularists of doing the same thing that I have accused him of doing with his religion, namely waving off secular abuses as perversions of principles and effectively accepting credit without also accepting blame. I don't accept it because I don't think it's fair to treat Christianity or any particular religion and secularism as though they are the same thing. Secularism is not a religion. It is a lack of religious belief and religious practice. Secular governments are governments that take no position on religious matters and which treat followers of all religions, as well as followers of no religions, equally before the law. And that's it. That's what secularism is. Beyond those principles, there is no specific ideology or code of ethics or creed or whatever that you need to adhere to in order to be considered a secularist. Though there is such a thing as secular ethics, there are multiple forms of secular ethics, secularism doesn't come with a specific set of rules for moral thought that you must accept and that you must live by in order to be considered secular. There are verses in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scriptures that can be interpreted as calling for violence, condoning slavery, condoning mistreatment of women, LGBTQ folk, members of other religions, etc. Most modern followers of these religions don't interpret these verses in this way, particularly in more secular parts of the world, I might add. But nonetheless, they are there, and they are sometimes interpreted in that way. Secularism, on the other hand, has no scriptures at all to interpret. It has no creeds to profess. There are no teachings of secularism that followers of secularism have to wrestle with and try to figure out what it means and what responsibilities it places on them. The only principle of secularism is a lack of religion. And when it comes to government, treating all religion equally under the law. That's it. That's it. There are many positive, beneficial principles that are compatible with secularism, but which aren't necessary to secularism and which don't require secularism in order to be practiced. And there are also many toxic, harmful principles that are compatible with secularism, but which aren't necessary to secularism and could just as easily be part of many religious societies. So when Hart refers to injustices that seem to follow from secularist principles, what is he talking about? Of course, there are injustices in secular societies. Of course, there can be warped, harmful codes of ethics with a non-religious character. But unless you can show how those injustices or those ethics are tied to secularism by something more than just being possible under a secular system, I don't see how it's reasonable to blame that injustice on secularism. We can all point to abuses and injustices that have taken place in secular societies, but blaming those injustices on secularism itself strikes me as a bit like blaming the devastation caused by an atomic bomb on science. There's more from Hart in this chapter. Quote, "Can one really believe, as the new atheists seem to do, that secular reason, if finally allowed to move forward free of the constraining hand of archaic faith, will naturally make society more just, more humane, and more rational than it has been in the past? What evidence supports such an expectation?" Speaking only for myself, I don't think a lack of religion will automatically make for a more just, humane, rational society. Human beings are perfectly capable of getting things wrong, thinking irrationally, and finding reasons to treat each other like shit without religion. But I do agree with what Matt Dillahunty has often said, that we ought to try as much as possible to believe true things more than false things. This doesn't apply exclusively to religion, but it does apply, since many, if not most, religious claims are either demonstrably false or unfalsifiable in nature. If we make an effort to base our beliefs as much as possible on evidence, if we make our beliefs as much as possible verifiable, substantiated, then we will be better equipped to make good decisions. We'll be able to make more useful, accurate predictions. We'll be less vulnerable to deception and manipulation. If we admit that none of us is perfectly rational, that we have biases and prejudices, many of which we may not even be aware of, then we're better able to recognize and confront and correct for those biases and prejudices when we notice them, when they are brought to our attention by other people. And that will make it easier for us to become better, more informed, more tolerant, more empathetic. It will make it easier for us to improve as individuals and for our society to grow and improve and become more tolerant and more just and more equal and more inclusive and all kinds of really wonderful good things. Now, will we still fall short? Sure. Is there any guarantee that we will make any progress at all? No, there is no guarantee that any of that will happen. But we sure increase our chances if we commit ourselves to discovering and confronting the world as it actually is, rather than how we wish it to be, or how we assume it is, before we've actually looked. One of the most harmful lessons that I think folks often learn from religion, particularly conservative Orthodox versions where the absolute authority of the church and usually a very flat literalist interpretation of the holy books are taught, is to credulously accept received information. Religion isn't the only place where people are taught to respect arguments from authority, but it is such a place, and many people are taught to respect arguments from authority in churches, in synagogues, in mosques, in religious institutions all over the world of many different faiths. And that doesn't do anyone any good, except those who claim to be speaking for the authority which is supposedly issuing the argument. Now, after that quote that I shared, Hart goes on another diatribe about modernity, lamenting the millions of lives sacrificed, as he sees it, on the altar of progress and secularism. And as I mentioned before, he's right that modern wars have resulted in far higher casualties than wars of centuries past. But as I've also mentioned before, this is probably due not to secularism, but to the increase in Earth's human population, and also the advancements of weapons technology. There are simply a lot more of us, and we have created far more efficient methods of killing ourselves than we had in the good old days of united Christendom that Hart pines for so pathetically. If Hart wants to argue that secularism is a bad thing that leads to death and oppression and the crushing of the human spirit, it seems to me he could make such an argument without comparing the past to the present, which is problematic for a whole bunch of reasons, but by comparing relatively secular parts of the world to parts of the world where religion has more influence. And that isn't perfect either, but at least we can compare societies that coexist on the planet right now today, instead of having to compare people living today in vastly different circumstances to people living decades or even centuries in the past. Now, I don't think Hart wants to do that, though, because if he did, he couldn't possibly argue that secularism was what we should really be afraid of, and then expect to be taken seriously. Compare societies where there is a separation of church and state, or if there is not a formal separation of church and state, for instance, like a society like the United Kingdom, where there is an established church, but where religions are treated equally under the law and religious institutions do not take an active role in government. Take societies like those, secular societies. Compare them to societies with theocratic forms of government. Which societies tend to have better human rights records? Which societies tend to have smaller amounts of gender inequality? Because secular societies still have gender inequality. But which ones do you think have more? The secular societies or the more overtly religious theocratic societies? In which societies are people more liberated? Is it the more religious societies or is it the less religious societies? Less religious is not automatically better. More religious is not automatically worse. But I think it's obvious if you look at the world today that many of the most oppressive regimes on the planet are theocratic in nature and have religious establishments that are very conservative and very orthodox in nature. Secular societies still have problems. Secular societies can still be extremely unjust and oppressive. Witness the injustices faced by Black Americans, for one very prominent example. But overall, in general, look at the world and tell me you wouldn't rather live in a place with a secular government and a legal and cultural tradition of religious equality and pluralism than somewhere with a state religion where both policy and social norms are shaped by the teachings of one particular denomination, of one particular religion. And yet, despite preferring that the church not be a state institution, because of course the state might corrupt the church, Hart has spent this entire book arguing the merits of just such a society where both the law and social norms are shaped by the teachings of one particular denomination, of one particular religion. The key difference, it's his religion. And obviously society would be better off were it more guided by his religion, because that's always the way, isn't it? Let's move on now to the final chapter of the book. Chapter 17, which is titled Sorcerers and Saints. And Hart comes into this final chapter with guns blazing. He says, quote, "It may well be that when Christianity passes away from a culture, nihilism is the inevitable consequence, precisely because of what Christianity itself is." Notice that he doesn't say nihilism is inevitable when a society is secularized. Notice he doesn't say nihilism is inevitable because of the materialism of modern society. He says when Christianity, his religion, is forsaken, nihilism is inevitable. And even though Hart has previously defined nihilism for his purpose here somewhat more narrowly than it is typically defined, as a lack of belief in transcendent meaning and not a belief that life is totally meaningless, it's still obvious that he considers it a bad thing. Even this more limited sense of nihilism is obviously a bad thing for Hart. So there's this bad thing that happens to a culture, and it happens because his specific religion goes away. The blatant bias of Hart for his religion and against anything that is not his religion, including other religions, has been a very prominent feature throughout this book. So I'm not surprised to see him returning to it here as we come to the end. Nor is it really unwise for him to do so from a certain perspective. Hart clearly assumes that his readers will be fellow Christians. So Christianity is the only cure for the hopelessness of the modern age is a message very likely to resonate with those readers. Like most of what Hart has done in the book, it's a more high-minded variation of a well-worn trope of apologists and evangelists. It's Hart's version of when John Hagee starts ripping through all the various nicknames of God as the applause of his congregation builds and builds and builds with each name that he rattles off. He is living water. He is the Alpha and Omega. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is the King of kings, Lord of lords. Give him praise and glory in the house of God. Gets him every time. Every time. And he does it pretty much every time too. Just flip on any random episode of John Hagee's show and he will, I can almost guarantee you, that he will run through that exact bit that I just did. Anyway, Hart would never present his message in such an undignified and panderingly populist voice, but what he does in this book amounts to the same thing, telling the Christians in his audience what they want to hear, which is that they have the right religion. Quote, "One of the more distressingly distinctive features of modern thought, it often seems, is its almost invincible tendency toward fundamentalism. Even religious fundamentalism in the West is primarily a modern phenomenon, as anyone who knows the history of biblical exegesis is aware. An absurd and reactive mimicry of modern scientific positivism. And nowhere at present is the fundamentalist tendency more prevalent and indurated than in certain quarters of the scientific community, or among those who look exclusively to the sciences for guidance in this world. So fundamentalism is bad, including religious fundamentalism. I can get behind that. Very reasonable. But religious fundamentalism is a mimicry of scientific fundamentalism, and fundamentalism is more prevalent in scientific circles than in religious ones? What is he talking about? Let me say that I agree it's a bit narrow to believe that you should look exclusively to the sciences for guidance in this world. Guidance in this world covers a lot of territory. And while the sciences are a remarkable and richly rewarding source of knowledge and understanding and discovery, there's also art and literature and philosophy, politics, sports, sex, a vast array of diverse human experiences, the wisdom of other people, all of which can give our lives meaning and offer us guidance as we struggle to find our way through our lives. Personally, I don't know anyone who argues that the sciences and only the sciences should be a source of guidance in this world. What I am familiar with, and what I think Hart is actually intending to argue against here, is the view that the scientific method is the only reliable way we have to gain knowledge about the world. Observation, hypothesis, experiment, evaluation. If not through this process, how are we supposed to figure anything out about the world outside of our own minds? And I honestly don't know. It's not just, I've said this in videos before, I'm not just saying that the scientific method is our best method. I don't know how else you do it. I don't know how else you figure things out and verify that you've gotten it right without the scientific method. I've never heard anyone describe to me another method that would work just as well, if not better than that, or that would even work at all. But recognizing that the scientific method is the best we've got for figuring stuff out is different from saying that we ought to consult only the sciences for guidance in our lives. What I'm also familiar with, and what I think Hart might also be intending to argue against when he talks about people who appeal only to the sciences for guidance, is the view that everything we experience and everything that exists can ultimately be accounted for by the physical. That it is not necessary to appeal to the supernatural, the miraculous, the divine, in order to explain how anything works, or where anything came from, or to derive meaning and purpose and satisfaction from one's life. This too is very different from the scientific fundamentalism that Hart references. So let's see what Hart has to say as we come to the close of this final chapter. I'm just going to savor it. Just savor it for a second. Okay, that was all I needed. Quote, "I should note here that I have not written this book as some sort of frantic exhortation to an improbable general religious renewal. I do not, at any rate, anticipate a recovery under current circumstances, and I cannot at the moment envisage how those circumstances might change. This should certainly be no cause of despair for Christians, however, since they must believe their faith to be not only a cultural logic, but a cosmic truth, which can never finally be defeated. Even so, it may be the case that Christians who live amid the ruins of the old Christendom, perhaps dwelling on the far-flung frontiers of a Christian civilization taking shape in other lands, will have to learn to continue the mission of their ancient revolution in the desert, to which faith has often found it necessary at various times to retreat." The line there about Christians believing their faith to be a cosmic truth is one of the only times in the entire book where Hart refers to the claims of Christianity as actually being true. He talks about Christian morality, Christian principles, the way Christianity supposedly changed, the way we see ourselves, gave us a new narrative by which to understand our existence, but he almost never says that the reason Christianity is the best belief system to guide our lives and shape our society is because it's true. He makes a lot of claims about the value and benefits of Christianity, but these claims could be valid, could be true, whether the religion itself is true or not. I suppose that was a conscious choice of Hart to focus on the supposed uniqueness of Christianity rather than the truth of its central claims. But it's odd when I think about it to have just finished a book by a Christian theologian where very little hinges on whether or not Christianity is actually true. So anyway, just like an old man who just likes to hear himself complain about stuff, Hart ends the book by admitting not merely that he doesn't have a solution in mind for the problems he's described, but that he doesn't think things will get any better anytime soon for any reason, because the world just sucks. You know, everything sucks now. That's just how it is. That's how it's going to be. Might as well get used to it. Unless you want to take your Christian mission to the desert, by which he means the parts of the world where Christianity has not yet taken root and where therefore it also hasn't yet fallen out of fashion. You want to bring back the glory days of old Christendom? Well, forget about doing it here. This place has gone to shit and it ain't never coming back. Go to Africa or Asia or something. He writes an entire book about a problem he doesn't know how to fix and doesn't think will or can be fixed. What is the reason for this book to exist other than as a platform for this man to bloviate at great, tedious length? You know what? Never mind. I think I just answered my own question. That's it, folks. That's it for this series. That's it for the examination of Atheist Delusions. I hope you enjoyed it. This series was a little bit different for me. If you watch some of the earlier episodes in this series, you might have detected me sort of struggling to figure out my way into it because the book itself is a lot different from the other apologist books that I've done, mainly for the reason I described toward the end there, because it's not really built on making and defending claims about Christianity and whether or not it's true, but it was a lot of sort of diversions into Christian history and a lot of just endless, as I said a moment ago, bloviating by Hart on his opinion of why things were better back in the day and why things are worse now and where the church went wrong and how modernity is. So it was a lot different to respond to than many of the other apologist books. I think eventually I figured my way into it and found a pretty good rhythm and a pretty good voice for this series. But I hope you agree. I hope it was of some use to you, of some interest to you. Please, as always, feel free to leave a comment on this video to let me know if I got something right, if I got something wrong, whatever your response is to what I've had to say, to what David Bentley Hart has had to say, whether you are an atheist yourself or a Christian or something else. If you have a thought on my thoughts shared in this video, I would be very interested to read what you have to say in the comments. So please do leave a comment on what I've had to say in this video. And also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it and subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already. And also, please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/SteveShives to become a patron of this channel. That is it for this series, but I am breaking with precedent this year, because usually I do 3 An Atheist Reads series a year, and then I take the rest of the year off to do Steve and Stuffy videos. But because the series this year were a bit shorter than series in the past, and I have finished up the An Atheist Reads series, or I would be finished if I stopped now, a lot earlier in the year than typically I would be, I am going to take a 2-week break from An Atheist Reads, during which I will be making and uploading Steve and Stuffy videos on Thursdays in this slot in my upload schedule. And if you are watching this and you've never watched one of my Steve and Stuffy videos, I would invite you to watch them because they're my favorite things that I do. I really love the Steve and Stuffy videos. They're a lot different. They're funny, or at least they aim to be funny. And they're just sort of little short films, little sketches, and they're comedic, and they have some social commentary, and they're just mostly just very silly and fun, and I adore them. And if you haven't watched one of them, I would invite you to just check it out next week if you've never watched one before, or check out one of the old ones on my channel right now. But after that, after a 2-week Steve and Stuffy break, I'm going to do another Atheist Reads series, one more this year, and then I will take the rest of the year off and just devote my energies for the Thursday videos to Steve and Stuffy from then to the end of the year. But the book I'm going to do for the 4th Atheist Reads series this year is a short book titled In Search of God by Robert Hawks. So if you are someone who likes to buy the book or get the book from the library or acquire the book in some way and read along with me, that is the book in the next and final Atheist Read series of this year, In Search of God by Robert Hawks. So get that book. I will see you in 2 weeks for the beginning of, actually I'll see you in 3 weeks, because I'm going to do next week and then another week and then the Atheist Read series. So I'm taking 2 weeks off, and then I'll see you in 3 weeks. Math is fun, isn't it? Especially for English majors. I'll see you in 3 weeks for the beginning of the An Atheist Reads In Search of God series. Until then, on Thursdays, it's Steve and Stuffy. I hope you enjoy it if you watch it, and I will see you back here, hopefully, for the start of the In Search of God series. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time.